Welcome to All Things Social Security. My name is Stephanie Joy of Joy Disability. I am a Social Security disability attorney, and I would like to invite you to watch our daily video tips on the Social Security disability and SSI claims process each day at the new time of noon Eastern Standard Time here on YouTube on this channel. And on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have our live Q&A live stream. So you are welcome to join that as well. Ask your questions, get there on time, and you'll be one of the first answered. Thanks so much and have a great day. Enjoy the video. Good morning, afternoon, evening. I just want to have a little chat about stress and how it may or may not relate to a Social Security disability or SSI claim. It came up in a recent question in the Q&A. You might have just heard it. I'm not sure if it's going to be attached first to this, or maybe after. I'm not sure. But the question involved is stress a disability? Now, stress is an environmental, this is the way I would look at it, okay? Stress is like an environmental factor, that can make life more difficult for some people. Everyone seems to have their degree of ability to tolerate stress and function properly and continue to do what they're supposed to do. And we're talking about usually in the work setting. But of course, when you're doing a disability claim, you're usually not in the work setting. So that's where how you handle stress in the regular, non-pressured area in terms of work of the non-working life. So when we look at, there is a listing for, where is it now? Oh, 15. And this is really not what I'm going to go into about stress and how it can be used for the typical claimant. Because 1215 is about trauma and stress-related disorders. They go into, we could go into it a different day, but if you look at 1215, it goes into, when you've been exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or violence. It's not the type of stress from being irritated on the job by your coworker who has a sniveling nose voice and you don't like, it drives you crazy. It's not that kind of thing. So the kind of stress that I think comes up most often, and I think it's also reflected in the function report, they ask about if you're able to, how do you feel you handle stress? And it is true, I think, that a lot of people who have come under serious impairment and disability to the point where they can't even work, whether or not they could be found disabled or not, but they weren't able to do their prior work for whatever length of time. I very rarely see someone who doesn't feel like their ability to tolerate stress and dominate it, if you will, has not been impacted. A related question right underneath that one is about changes to routine. Because if you think about it, if you're demanded to change your routine at work on a dime, or maybe not quite on a dime, but in short order, that is a piece of stress because you have to react properly to that. And again, people have varying degrees of how they're able to do that. And it all really does depend on the mental state of the person. So some people have very little capacity left to deal with that kind of demand for change of routine, or to handle stresses, fighting in the household, for instance, or the stress of a bill that's unpaid and you don't know how it's going to be paid. Those are the things one can look at, how the interpersonal reactions are when someone is feeling stressed. A lot of people will say, kind of isolate and go to my room and just kind of try to get out of the situation. And to me, that's a sign that they do not feel that they can handle that stressful, whatever the situation is at the moment, and they have to leave. Maybe it's because they will break down and cry. Maybe they know that they will lose their temper or get very defensive, and then a big argument will ensue. It could be anything because it's such a personal situation. So when just because you very well might not meet 1215 on the listing doesn't mean any impacted stress capacities, tolerance to handle stress is not important. And it's important on that particular aspect of the function report, I think. But it also suggests that if one's having it, they should probably, and for legal reasons, if no other reason, be having that medically checked out with maybe a mental health therapist that helps one develop coping skills for that. Now, yes, hopefully you improve with it, with the skills that are taught, those coping skills. But the mere fact that you're having the problems and it's significant enough to try to seek help helps illustrate to the SSA that it is impacting your life. And if it's impacting your life when you're home and not dealing with the pressures of a 9 to 5 and bringing the paycheck and all that and having to, withstand demands of bosses and coworkers and all that, I would argue that that means you would do even less generally. There are exceptions, a less stellar job when you have it in the workplace where you have to rise and shine to people that are not your family members. And when it's a competitive work environment, right? That's what they describe where we were, competitive work environment. And when we're in a competitive work environment, it can be more difficult to not feel the stress of making errors. Errors that nobody's going to notice if we're at home, particularly if we live alone, or our family may not notice, but in the job, part of the job is doing it right. That's why we're getting paid. So when you think about, when you do that part of your function report, you're thinking about the stress. Again, it's not so much, I would say it's not a disability. Stress is an environmental factor. It's around everybody. There's various degrees of stress, and each person internalizes it differently and handles it differently and has different tolerances. One thing that could be stressful to someone else might not be stressful to me at all. And it can be very related to anxiety disorders. I think almost always you're going to find a connection there. So let's say someone has a social phobia and just hates going out in public and just really, really has gone reclusive and isolating. That would be very different for me, where I can walk right in the grocery store and strut my stuff and go get what I need, and it's not an issue. But for someone else, that could be crushing. And they might actually only order online and have it delivered and never go because they are going to be so on edge. They're going to be sweaty palms and all those physical reactions that can occur when we are not having stress that we're able to tolerate. It increases all those symptoms. So when you're thinking about stress, and particularly on the function report, whether it's due to an anxiety disorder, whether it's due to a mood disorder, it really can vary what the diagnosis can be, but you really want to have it diagnosed. They're not going to diagnose you with stress. And short of some other major things evidencing themselves, it's not going to be PTSD. It's kind of different. PTSD is a result of some severely traumatic incident or incidences, whereas an inability to tolerate stress in a normal fashion or to the degree that one would expect an average person to withstand is something different. And again, it can be anxiety disorder. It can be a mood disorder. Someone could be bipolar, and during certain cycles, perhaps certain amounts of stress will trigger them to react poorly. And one of the things, when you look at the required mental capacities we have to have for all jobs, including the most simple, unskilled, minimum wage, no training needed kind of job, some of the things that a bad stress reaction, if it's a habit, can affect are the ability to interact appropriately with coworkers and supervisors. If someone is known to go off the handle, and there's going to have to be evidence of this. So this is why you have to have that therapist where you talk to them about the incidences. Or perhaps you got fired from a job for lipping off at a supervisor. Those would be good indicators, objective evidence, I'd say, particularly the one with the employer, that the ability to tolerate the stress of, say, criticism from a supervisor, or a demand for another hour of work, or can you speed it up and make more of those widgets, whatever the case may be. So the stress reaction can be an inability to interact appropriately in a reliable, typical day with supervisors or coworkers. If someone isn't able to deal with the public, that's really not going to eliminate all jobs. Actually, neither will the inability to really properly handle coworkers. There are jobs apparently where you don't have to interact with coworkers, but every job entails having to deal with a supervisor. And I believe if one cannot at least occasionally interact with the supervisor properly, it'll probably be, if the SSA were to believe it, so you have to have all the really strong evidence of this, that would mean you can't do any jobs. Now, the irony is, and I've talked about this in other videos, they will say, oh, well, he has a capacity that's limited to occasional interaction with a supervisor. In other words, occasional is up to 1/3 of the day. More than that would be 2/3 of the whole day. And they're saying, okay, he can't interact with the supervisor properly for more than 1/3 of the day, but he can do it for 1/3 of the day. Therefore, there are jobs. And my counter is always, and I've done this in hearings with the vocational expert, does the worker get to choose when that 1/3 of the day is? If it's 1 out of every 3 minutes or 20 minutes out of every hour, he might have to interact with a supervisor. Does he get to pick when those times are, or does the supervisor get to pick? Can the employee say, can't talk to you right now, supervisor. I'm not in that mode where I can actually properly interact with you. So you're gonna have to wait. I don't think so. And I've never really had a VE dispute the fact that if it's 1/3 of the day, that the employer could probably tolerate. It is an unpredictable part wherever that 1/3 falls. Which minutes is it? These minutes here? Is this hour number 5? Is it worse than hour number 7? Is he best in the morning? Is he not a morning person? When does the employer get to pick when those interactions with the supervisor take place? I mean, obviously, sometimes an employee will go to a supervisor and say, "Hey, I want to talk to you about something." He's probably going to pick the times when he can do it best. But what about when the supervisor addresses the employee? Will the employee be fired if he says, "Not now, supervisor, you're going to have to come back in an hour. I can't speak to you right now." It's just not going to happen. So I think it's something to bring up when a judge acknowledges that from the medical evidence an individual is limited to occasional interaction with the supervisor, because I would get into it. Do these employers allow the employee to pick when that supervisor is allowed to speak with him? It just isn't going to happen. So it's just something to throw in there. And then you have it on appeal if the ALJ shoots down the case in any event. So stresses like that affect job performance and behaving with the supervisor and coworkers and the public, if that's the jobs you're looking at, is all going to be part of that. It could also be, depending on what the disorder is. Sometimes they can't keep a schedule. I'm trying to think of an example. Someone with OCD, for instance, which kind of gets them very stressed when they're trying to wash their hands 50 times before they leave to go to work. And a lot of times they're late for work because they have to keep checking the door and go back and check the stove and wash their hands again because they just touched the stove to make sure it was off and check that the door is locked. If a stress reaction causes that kind of distraction and inability to get out of the house at the time that you were so sure you're going to be able to, you left enough time for a shower and getting dressed for work, and now you're still late, not because you didn't do those things as per your alarm, but because all these other invasive thoughts that made you do all these OCD things kicked in. So try to be open-minded when you think about stress, all the ways it can affect. If it's severe enough, guys, it's not going to be if it's just I'm feeling stressed, but if it's gotten to the tipping point. And I will say this, for people who have to disprove that they can do a high skilled job like they used to, let's say they're trying to disprove their like under the grids that they could do the prior work, then an inability to deal with high stress might very well kick out that prior work where it was really high stress back when the person could do it. Now they're not able, and one of the reasons is the stress. So it might not be that they can't do that job for physical reasons. They can no longer do light work. They're limited to sedentary. It might not be that. It might be due to stress and that reaction. But you have to have a diagnosis. And I don't think they're going to diagnose you with stress because that's more of an environmental factor. But your inability to handle it in a healthy manner and react properly. So just things to delve into when you're thinking about getting some therapy that will produce records that prove this, because you'll be talking to a therapist or, whoever happens to be the counselor about what's happening when you feel stressed. If it's just a feeling of stress, it's probably not going to be a big deal because everyone feels stress. It's how they manage it in real time. Not even so much, well, then I just go to yoga or whatever. Not so much that. Is it working what you're doing so that your behavior is appropriate, your reactions are appropriate on the job. And of course, you're not working, like we said, you're at home, but how is it manifesting itself at home? I mean, if the stress is no longer a problem now that you're out of the workforce, and by the way, I believe that's entirely possible, but it's a little bit more difficult to then establish that it is so. And I would say oftentimes if someone is having a severe stress intolerance and not reacting properly, like they look like they're nuts, on the job when they go off on somebody, that will often show up at home, though. It might be in the grocery store, long lines, idiot customers that are annoying you, or, it could be on the road, like a road rage. You got to look at everything and even maybe ask your loved ones, hopefully you have some, and ask them what they see, if they notice anything to say, because sometimes we can't see what we do. It just blows right by us because we're in the midst of it, but they might see it. So we do that here all the time. I'll be like, "Oh, Dad, you do this all the time," or they'll say it about me, or my kid, my kids will say it, or I'll say it about my daughter, like, "Oh, well, you always do that." So sometimes other people that love you will notice things. They just don't talk about it because, nobody wants to hurt your feelings, or it's just part of the course. But, you can find out a little more insight. And again, you're going to have objective evidence of that, or medical evidence, which means you have to get it documented, and not just once, on an ongoing basis. And that's where we say it's probably good to go to a therapist, not just because it might be good for you to develop coping skills to help better deal with that stress and make yourself feel better and be healthier, because we know stress really affects our physical well-being also, but for your case too. Yeah, I don't like to give medical advice because I'm not a medical person, but so everything I say is all about, in the end, getting your legal evidence, what's admissible and what gives it more weight, makes it more persuasive than other really weak but admissible evidence that isn't going to save your case. So, alrighty. So that whole stress thing, I thought it was a good question of the person. Is it a disability? And I think, no, it's not really a disability. It is more like an environmental factor that you cannot tolerate. It could be like, just to make it simple, cold intolerance. Some people cannot, their fingers will turn blue or white and they can't work in the cold. Is the cold a disability? No, it is an environmental factor that they can't tolerate. Climbing upstairs, someone has bad balance. They might not be able to climb upstairs. So the stairs are not the disability. It is an environmental factor that they cannot overcome. They can't safely navigate them, for instance. I don't know if that helps. So anyway, stress, guys, it's like everybody seems to have it, and people that have lost their job or inability to work and are trying to get disability, by and large, have a lot of it. I would say possibly more than the rest of us. Although sometimes it's really heavy when you're at work, and then when you finally cut that back, it does pull back a little bit. But by then, the disabilities or the impairments are now another worrying factor that's stressing us out. And sometimes it just gets to be too much. And our ability to surmount it as fast as it has come upon us is just not sufficient. Over time, maybe with therapy and learning the tricks of the trade in terms of dealing with stress could help. But right now, in the midst of a disability claim, you may as well use it if you got it. So I hope those are a couple tips that you could potentially think about if you find that you're not handling stress as well. And again, those changes to routine are indicators, as well as how we deal with coworkers and supervisors. And again, the ability to get out the door. Sometimes stress holds us back with that too. All right, guys, I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.